have to understand in this institution that was mandated, entrusted to ensure that never again is right now the topic of our gathering today. When I sit here in this building,
that was Michal Cotler-Wunsh speaking 2 years ago to a room full of UN ambassadors in New York, her passionate speech given just after October 7th. She had been Israel's new special envoy to combat antisemitism for only a couple of weeks. She took over the post from Noah Tishby, the former actor, who was fired after she criticized the Netanyahu government's plans for judicial reform. For her part, Cotler-Wunsh had big hopes. There would be a budget and the political backing for her to represent Israel abroad, do research on anti-Semitism, and also make good on her country's commitment that it would protect diaspora Jews around the world. All, she says, was based on promises she got from Israel's foreign ministry. But the Hamas attack on Israel put everything on hold. She was told there was no money coming, and for the next 2 years, the Canadian-raised human rights lawyer and former Israeli politician rolled up her sleeves and flew around the world as a pro-Israel advocate. She says she had to ask her hosts to cover her travel costs where possible, as she jetted from continent to continent and to Canada many times. It was something she had seen her father do. Irwin Cotler was Canada's first anti-Semitism envoy, and for 3 years the former Justice Minister was also a one-man band. But that changed when former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appointed Deborah Lyons to replace him just after October 7th, and along with it came a $7 million allotment in the last budget to keep that office going for years. Cotler-Wunsh was also tired of being ghosted, she says, by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, who rejected her proposals, gave her no resources, and wouldn't even hold meetings with her. She feels that while Israel has been fighting terrorists and enemies on 7 fronts, including Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iran, her country has failed to appreciate there's another war still raging. The 8th front, she calls it, the information war for public opinion, a war that hasn't had a ceasefire and shows no sign of stopping, despite U.S. President Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan to end the fighting in Gaza.
I'll say Israel, too, as a democracy, has a very important shared responsibility in understanding the moment that we are in, which I view as an existential moment in a raging war of barbarism on our shared civilization.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, October 20th, 2025. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. It's interesting that Cotler-Wunsh handed in her resignation letter on the same day, September 29th, as Donald Trump announced his peace plan alongside with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington. Her resignation was effective immediately, but she's not going anywhere. She starts a new job as CEO of the International Legal Forum. It's an NGO based in Israel. It counts 4,000 lawyers in 40 countries as volunteers. They defend Israel at UN bodies, including the ongoing war crimes and the genocide cases in The Hague, but also they represent Hamas victims who are suing UNRWA. They fight BDS boycotts. They're even taking on Columbia University for discriminating against Jews. Some may call it lawfare. And it's also got high-profile military names on its board, who you've likely heard of, including British Army veteran officers Colonel Richard Kemp and Major Andrew Fox, and the West Point Academy instructor Major John Spencer. These pro-Israel experts defend Israel's military tactics. We reached Michal Cotler-Wunsh at her home in Israel to find out more about why she resigned and what Israel got wrong.
We should make it more often and for better reasons, but it's good to be here.
I think we met at a U of T encampment, right?
That's right.
And you were there and you were horrified and that seems like a long time ago. Today we're speaking at a momentous time in Israel's and Jewish people's history with the return of many of the hostages and of course some of the remains of those who were kidnapped and killed in Gaza. Let's talk about why you stepped down, or when did it become clear to you that this was no longer tenable for you to be Israel's representative fighting anti-Semitism?
I'll just, as a reminder, I was appointed to the role of Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism 3 weeks before October the 7th, with the intention of actually making clear that we need a strategy, a national strategy for combating anti-Semitism, except that in Israel's case, as the nation state of the Jewish people, it has a very, very significant component of an international strategy for combating anti-Semitism. And in many, many ways, all that I did in the past 2 years in that role, and I should mention in that voluntary capacity, because Israel did not have the infrastructure for that role, nor does it have the infrastructure now. The goal was actually to build that infrastructure, except that we have been in what has been over 2 years or 2 years of a 7-front war, theoretically having come to some sort of an agreement on the 2-year marker. And I'll say, from my perspective, an 8th front of war that actually we would be remiss if we thought has any ceasefires. This 8th front of war that manifests in not just a tsunami of anti-Semitism, and you said we met last year, in what, for me, actually, I wasn't horrified at all, nor was I surprised. I was there to sound the sirens in order to make clear that the tsunami of anti-Semitism, in response to what I had called the Kristallnacht moment of our times, i.e. October the 7th, the tsunami of anti-Semitism was precisely the response that will do what we are seeing today, that is, the normalization of anti-Semitism. The 8th front of war, multi-front war was raging, but this 8th front of an unconventional war for public opinion that has been raging for decades requires not just the state of Israel to, if you will, equip itself with the understanding and the weapons of this 8th front. And in that sense, my capacity as Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, and I should mention alongside special envoys from around the world, including Canada itself, and we know that Canada's special envoy resigned, in many ways failed. The understanding that the warning signs that actually could have prevented and predicted the normalization of anti-Semitism failed over the last 2 years. And the proof in the pudding, if you will, is the normalization of anti-Semitism, including in Canada, including in the modern mainstream strain of just anti-Zionism that denies Israel's very right to exist and attacks Jews and Zionists, including in Canada, on campuses, on streets, in broad daylight, with nobody coming to the aid of, including a Montreal father, whose 5-year-old little girl is hiding until the person beating him to a pulp is done, throwing his kippah to the side. So we are in the new realm, post-normalization, that in the aftermath of the October 7 massacre that I have called the Kristallnacht moment of our times has become not just normalized, but acceptable, an acceptable new strain of anti-Semitism. And that is not something that the state of Israel will be able to combat alone. This 8th front requires understanding it from the root. The root being the international law, institutions, mechanisms, principles that were systematically hijacked, weaponized, redefined, inverted, among other things, to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the state of Israel, Jew among nations, but that collapses the international rules-based order. And so that transitions directly into my new role as CEO of the International Legal Forum that enables international collaboration that begins at the root and does not just address the symptoms, anti-Semitism being one of them, with a collaborative, proactive, strategic approach.
And my understanding that you were never given staff, an office, a budget, anything. It was just you as the front and running around the world. And
3 weeks after my appointment to the role, an all-out war, existential war, was waged on the state of Israel. And I mentioned the 7 fronts of war under which Israel has been under constant attack on and since October the 7th. Well, in that sense, the authority, the budget, the infrastructure that this role would require in order to be able to carry it out in the way that it needs to be carried out is still non-existent. And I'll add to that, I see this, as I said before, as a joint responsibility. It is not Israel's responsibility alone. And as, from my international law background and as a lawyer myself, I do see the next most effective platform in a much more international collaboration. It is not a war that Israel can or should fight alone. What we are seeing, if you will, as a mirror of the normalization of anti-Semitism is the normalization of terror and tyranny in Canada, in the UK, in Europe, in the US, the understanding that we have trillions of dollars pouring into democracies to normalize that terror and tyranny, of which anti-Semitism is both weapon and tool, makes this our shared responsibility. And all of us who cherish life and liberty as boots on the ground on this eighth front. And so it's a much more, from my perspective, a much more accurate platform from which to advance after the 2 years of witnessing, as I have what I have around the world, including, as you said, 2 years of travel to meet with legislators and university presidents and police chiefs and mayors and heads of corporations, and the understanding that anti-Semitism sounded a siren as the most reliable sign of a major threat to humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference, but that siren was not heard, was not audible across spaces and places, hopefully allows me to utilize this platform in a much more clear way to be able to say this is our shared responsibility, and all of us who care about the international rules-based order created post-World War II that was intended to ensure the never again principle, not just never again to Jews, never again the radical extremist forces that intend to collapse the foundations of our democracies and build an alternate reality on their rubble. That is the sort of cri de coeur, or the call to action, from my perspective, that I have after these 2 years of experiences and insights in what I hope will be a very effective platform.
You're not blaming the Israeli government for not listening to your reports. You figure that they had other bigger problems to deal with and it just was circumstances, or you gave them all kinds of opportunities and they just had ignored it.
The state of Israel has had a lot more to deal with, as I very well know, with the entire Israeli population deployed to 7 fronts of war, existential war. There is no way to actually pass over, gloss over, not only October the 7th itself, the butchered and raped and burned alive and massacred over 1,200 people and abducted 251 human beings, but to what has unraveled since October the 7th. And so it's not an excuse. It's an actual existential 7-front war that the state of Israel has been embroiled in. And were it a perfect world, yes, my recommendations would have included a much more effective strategy from within the state of Israel. But what I'm saying is a little bit different. What I'm saying is, regardless, it is the next stage of what I anticipate we are going to be facing. There is no ceasefire in this 8th front. Anti-Semitism has been normalized around the world. A lawyer was asked to remove his Magen David, his Star of David in the UK, because it is antagonizing to what is called pro-Palestinian protesters, which I emphasize over and over again. If they were pro-Palestinian, they would be protesting to free Gaza from Hamas that is torturing and executing Gazans now as we speak, in violation of an internationally brokered agreement again. And so we are in many ways in the next phase, perhaps more elusive phase, because sirens are not even ringing in Israel. The sirens I was trying to make audible in my travels of the last 2 years around the world, to make them audible around the world, are not even blaring here. But these sirens should be blaring. But we are about to mark 50 years on November the 10th to the UN resolution, Zionism is racism. We have to understand that as the foundation and the opening shot, if you will, of the hijacking of the international institutions and mechanisms created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect a post-World War II international rules-based order. 50 years. That's a very long time war that's been raging. And for anybody who does not understand why Zionism is racism, yes, rescinded about 20 years later, but it matters not, because blood libel always sticks. Alive and well on university campuses, on the streets, and online in 2025 in the name of progress and human rights. And that anti-Zionism is in fact racism, except that that resolution passed in the UN paved the path for the next blood libel spread. Therefore, Israel as an apartheid state becomes the next blood libel that is peddled. The most Orwellian inverted hijacking of fact and of law is, of course, the blaming of the state of Israel, the Jew among nations, of genocide, accusing it of genocide in the International Court of Justice by none other than South Africa, and across spaces and places, including human rights organizations themselves hijacked as part of this industry. So this is well beyond Israel. This is well beyond anti-Semitism. This is well beyond Jews and Zionists, the new legitimate targets of this ever-mutating hatred, because you need not be a Jew to actually be the target of anti-Zionism. You just need believe in Israel's very right to exist. This is actually about the foundational principles of our democracies. And instead of the international community and all of those institutions and all those mandated and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect, including the human rights industry that I've mentioned, all those organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, they have actually completely adopted the abdication of responsibility, enabling the collapse of this international rules-based order. And so we begin from law with the International Legal Forum. That doesn't mean that Israel does not have a very important role in this eighth front as well.
A lot of people have said that that your resignation shows that Israel has failed its efforts to help Jews around the world.
Now, I want to be very clear. There is never an excuse for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not a problem of Jews or of the Jewish nation state or the result of anything that Israel may or may not do. Anti-Semitism is a problem of anti-Semites and of the places and spaces that allow them to fester, to spread, to infest with this hate. That means it's the problem of Canada. It's the problem of the UK. It's the problem of France. It's the problem of Germany. It's the problem of the United States. Blaming Israel for raging anti-Semitism around the world, politicizing anti-Semitism will always fuel it. It has nothing to do with, and I can have my criticism to say there is a lack of understanding of this eighth front in Israel. And by the way, on multi-levels, there is an ongoing lack of understanding that the eighth front, as I used to say when I was a member of Knesset, will ultimately decide Israel's ability to fight on all other fronts, meaning this eighth front is an existential war for Israel. That is a part and parcel of my responsibility to make accessible internally and to hopefully affect policy and strategy change, as I have tried to do for the better part of the last 10 years. I'll say with another intersecting issue, for example, with the standing violation of not just agreement, but law and morality in the continued holding of deceased soldier Hadar Goldin, who's been in Gaza, held by the same Hamas, in standing violation of an internationally brokered humanitarian ceasefire for more than 11 years, meaning it is international failure. It is international law that has to be upheld equally and consistently if it is going to be able to protect as it was meant to. And we speak at a moment where those countries sitting around the UN Human Rights Council table are the most egregious violators of human rights. That's not just a problem for Israel, nor is it a matter of Israeli political leadership decisions or lack of understanding. That is a problem for the world. And we can criticize Canada, and we can criticize the UK, and we can criticize France, and we should, because it is their failure that has not only enabled the continued holding of Hadar Goldin for more than 11 years, but actually that enabled the October 7 massacre to abduct 251 more human beings. And it is their failure that has enabled the normalization of anti-Semitism.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your front and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
There was, why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
ILF has several lawsuits, court cases out there. For example, you mentioned ICC, ICJ, the UN's high courts. Why do you think that lawfare is the sort of new effective way you think can affect change against anti-Semitism?
In order to understand that the hijacking of law, that its inversion doesn't just endanger Israel. It's not just going to manifest in anti-Semitism or be used in this raging unconventional war that seeks to, in an axis of evil, that seeks to build an alternate reality on the rubble of civilization. Trillions of dollars, Qatari dollars, have poured into democracies, buying up real estate and sports teams and universities. You think that's a problem for Israel? You think that's just a problem for Jews or Zionists on campuses that are no longer welcome, as it said on the threshold on the entrance to NYU law, as it said on the sidewalk of New York, Zionists not welcome? Do we think that the entrance to NYU law school saying Zionists not welcome is a problem just for Zionists? Because if we do, we have failed to understand the existential moment and challenge of our time, with the potential collapse, and we're very near it, of the international rules-based order and its institutions. If the UN, the ICC that you mentioned, from my understand, the Prime Minister of Canada actually just said he will respect that the Prime Minister, democratically elected Prime Minister of the Jewish nation state, will be arrested if he lands in Canada. Well, and while at the same time we know that there are terror designated organizations, or haven't been designated yet in Canada, that are fully functional on cross campuses, as we witnessed at the U of T protests, violating including university policies, not to mention Canada's criminal code, hate speech, fighting words, incitement. So we are at that. It's a very good example of an existential moment, including what ILF does in its holding to account and creating the necessary partnerships of all those who understand around the world that this is not a moment that Israel will be able to fight on its own, or that Jews should be fighting on its own. For some, maybe double standard reason, there is this misunderstanding that anti-Semitism is the problem of Jews, and that what we need is actually to continue protecting Jews, actually preventing them from equal access to education, to their houses of prayer, to public spaces. It wasn't that long ago that my own friend and former rabbi in Montreal was actually asked to leave a public space.
Yeah.
That's right. So that he doesn't antagonize, much like in the UK the other day, so he doesn't antagonize the protesters. The problem is not going to be resolved if you just remove the Jew, remove the kippah, remove the Star of David.
We've seen so many things. Aston Villa now, of course, in the United Kingdom. And
but that's a good old double standard, because we would never entertain the thought for 1 second that who should be removed is the target of the hate, as I said, rather than the hater. I've had some incredible experiences in the last 2 years of understanding that there is a moderate majority out there that actually understands that this is not just about us. The only thing is that we have to create those allyships, that we have to create those collaborations, that we have to make accessible what it is that they are seeing. I don't know if you've seen the Hind Rajab report issued by ILF and other partners, but the understanding that there are going to be hunts of Israeli soldiers, not soldiers from any other country, but of Israeli soldiers who will potentially be arrested upon landing in certain countries, is not something that should be troubling only to us. And in fact, this Hind Rajab Foundation has direct ties to terror. So this is perhaps the most important, if nobody remembers anything else that I said. This is about extremism. It is extremism that's endangering our shared spaces and democracies. That extremism actually is rising. So mirroring the normalization of anti-Semitism is the normalization of the extremism of terror and tyranny, including in Canada. And in that sense, that's the work of ILF, and I very much hope to take it to the next level and identify the partners in what is our shared responsibility to, as I said, remember what it was that the international rules-based order intended to uphold, promote, and protect, and reclaim what it is that's being hijacked and weaponized, and renew that shared responsibility that perhaps many of our leaders have forgotten.
So practically on the ground, what would that look like? Helping financially to, for example, CIJA's legal task force to do more stuff here, partnering with other lawfare organizations like Brooke Goldstein's, and it's a financial and sort of brain trust support of these kinds of on-the-ground legal fights.
There are, as you said, other legal initiatives or law-focused initiatives. I think ILF can become a hub for the universal or global understandings of a lot of what we've spoken about, and they will have to be taken on then geographically, if you will, because laws do differ, and the way that we approach, whether it's the courts or the organizations or where we decide that something is actionable or not actionable, differs in different geographies. Right. The point being that the transcending politics and making this a completely apolitical or non-political issue has failed. We've seen around the world, antisemitism has been politicized. That is a gap that we will have to bridge, and that I very much hope that ILF will be able to engage in productively as well.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, brought to you by the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Cotler-Wunsh replaces outgoing CEO Arsen Ostrovsky, an Australian Jewish lawyer who has held the job for the last 5 years. With Cotler-Wunsh's departure, that now leaves 3 high-profile international government-appointed anti-Semitism jobs vacant. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney hasn't yet filled Deborah Lyon's post after 3 months. As you know, she stepped down this summer, half a year early, telling me on this show that it was due to the stress of not being able to convince enough good people to stand up for Canada's Jews. In the U.S., the post hasn't been filled yet either, 9 months since Deborah Lipstadt left her job, although a Florida rabbi got Trump's nomination months ago, but the Senate hasn't held confirmation hearings yet. Our show is produced by Andrea Varsany and Zachary Judah Kaufman. Michael Freeman is our executive producer, and Brett Higgins composed our theme. Thanks for listening.